Marlantes.
Well, thank you very much. Is this the one that I'm supposed to be talking on?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here, really, because the only contact I had with Asheville was reading, Look Homeward Angel when I was about a sophomore in high school. And I went to the Thomas Wolfe House this afternoon, and I said, it doesn't look like this. Because, I read it, raw in my little town in Oregon, and how can it look like that? So now I have to revise my entire view of the inner landscape of Wolfe's house. But it really was quite a pleasure to wander around there. I thought it might be interesting with people who are interested in writing in general, whether you're writing yourself or read about writers, how I ended up here in front of you, because it really was one of these stories that in the beginning, for the first 35 years, it was like, God, everything goes wrong with the publishing industry, you can't get anything done, and then everything went right. And it was a combination of independent bookstores and Barnes & Noble. I've asked for permission to say it. I came back, I had always written. Ever since I was a kid, I had written. In fact, my cousin and I wrote our first novel together when we were 9, and it was about space invaders taking over the Earth, but the Earth was saved by 2 9-year-olds. It was really sort of amazing. And then I wrote through high school and won some awards in college. So I was, thinking to myself when I finally got out of this mess in Vietnam, I was going to write the great American novel. And what's so horrible about the internet today is that once something is out and it's misunderstood, it's out and misunderstood forever. And one of the things is that the first draft of Matterhorn was 1,700 pages long. Not quite, because what happened is I got back and I manically, I can remember it was an Olympic electric typewriter. And it's just, and just a little more, for about 3 or 4 months. And I did punch out 1,700 pages of what I can only call first-person psychodump. It was pure CRAP. It was bad. And but it got a lot out. There were pages about, why can't the Marines give us dry socks? Things like that. Which, and when I went away and came back to look at it, I went, oh dear, this is not good. And so I started doing things that I really should have been doing, like reading books about how to structure plots and how to develop characters and all the things that people have discovered over the past several thousand years, and take advantage of that. And I came up with the central, I guess you could call it organizing metaphor, which is Matterhorn. It's this mountain that is taken by the Marines, and they build a fire support base on it, and then there's a screw up and they abandon it, but they don't blow up their bunkers, and then they have to take the hill back because the North Vietnamese army occupies it and then abandon it. And to me it was sort of a metaphor for the sort of self-inflicted wound that Vietnam seemed to be. The book is not pro or anti. I tried very hard to stay in my characters' heads. In fact, one of my theories of fiction is that if you can figure out the writer's politics, he probably hasn't done a very good job. You should be able to figure out the character's politics. And 19-year-olds are not interested in politics. They're interested in going home. They're interested in drinking beer, getting with their girlfriends. And, so this is the viewpoint that you get. And what I tried to do very hard was just, it's just our story. What is it like to be 19, having to grow up in a situation like that? And that's the story that I sort of set out to tell. But no one wanted to read it. 1977, it was about a little between 1,000 and 1,100 pages when I actually got this manuscript done, which was still huge. And I started writing query letters, and I went to the bookstores to read about writing query letters, but the lesson didn't take, apparently, because after about 25, it got sent out with all my careful research about people that would publish books about it. The few that answered the query letters, it was like unknown author, huge manuscript. Nobody wants to hear about this war. Nobody. We can't sell this book. Sorry. And so my first kid came along in '78, and you know, you cannot straighten teeth and pay for tap dance lessons writing fiction, I'll guarantee you. So I got working, and you know, I put it aside for you know, a year or two, and I went back at it in the mid '80s. When I ginned it up again, the same effort, and those that answered were, well, the market's gone, you missed it. You know, Hollywood, one guy said, well, Hollywood's already done Vietnam. We can't sell this book. You know, it was Full Metal Jacket, you know, the Apocalypse Now, Platoon. All right, you know, so back to the drawing boards, and actually, I have to say that it's one of those cases that careful what you wish for, because you might get it. And you know, I was feeling all sorry for myself, but the book turned out to be way better than if it had gotten published and forgotten by now, compared to what I had done with it way back in '60s. I was only 32 years old, something like that. So mid '90s, she was saying, I actually got a couple people saying, well, you know, why don't you just move it to the Gulf War? And, you know, we could probably sell that, it's topical. And I was so happy that Microsoft had come out with search and replace on Word, because I could just take jungle and desert and just, you know, and then turn this sucker around and, you know, get, okay, here it is, it's reset. I mean, you just wonder what's going on with these people's heads, you know. And what's going on is it is a difficult marriage between commerce and art. It just is, and I'm not upset about it. I was always sad because no one read the manuscript, but I can't say it was never rejected. No one ever read it. You know, I did 3 pages were rejected every once in a while. They said, send me 3 pages. And what 3 pages am I going to send? I never sent the right 3 pages apparently. And then, you know, in the early aughts, it was, you know, well, it's got a mountain in it, and Afghanistan's got mountains. You know, why don't you switch it there? Just put this platoon on top of a mountain in Afghanistan. And I was like, you know. And the way it actually got published was counter to the stereotypes. It was a chain of women that got this book published. You know, most women go, I don't do war books, you know. And a friend of mine was reading the manuscript, and he gets a phone call from a guy named Tom Farber. And Tom is a professor at Berkeley, teaches literature and creative writing. And they'd been college friends. What do you do, and blah, blah. And Tom had just started, a couple of years earlier, a little non-profit publishing house, because he said it's so difficult to get literature and fine photography into the commercial marketplace. And so he started El Leon Literary Arts, and the purpose of it was to get writers an actual product. In other words, instead of having to send manuscripts off to New York, or query letters about sending manuscripts off to New York, El Leon would actually, you know, make a small run. They'd go out and get donators to put up enough money for the run. And so my friend said, oh, he's got this great manuscript. And I'm sure Tom rolled his eyes, because everybody's got a friend with a manuscript if you're a publisher. So he said, well, send it to my senior editor, Kit Duane, and she'll take a look at it. And of course, I mean, Kit is the managing editor, the junior editor, I mean, because there's 2 people in this publishing house. There's Tom, who's the publisher, and there's Kit, who does all the everything, you know. And, so my friend's all excited. He calls me on the phone and he says, Carl, gosh, you know, and I said, wait a second, Ken, you know it cost me $52 to copy this thing at Kinko's. And you want me to spend $52 copying a manuscript about Marines in the Vietnam War and send it to a woman reader in Berkeley, California? No way. You know, I said, I'm just not going to do it, because I mean, it's just not going to fly, and I don't want to, you know, throw the $52 away. He shamed me. He said, I'll pay for the copying. Send her the manuscript. So I said, okay, I'll pay for the copying, and I sent it. And she loved this book, and she's the first one that read it, and she loved it, and she talked Tom into reading it, and Tom loved it, and so they got enough money together to make a run of 1,200 copies, and my pay was 123 copies. So now I had, you know, that was my pay, and it arrived in the garage, you know, just 120 books of Matterhorn, and if any of you are collectors, that early El Leon version is if you ever find one, apparently they're now becoming worth money because so few of them got out. Because the pub date was May of '09, 2 years ago. And so I started busily sending letters about how I'd gotten published into New York, publishers and New York agents, and it's already an edited book, and somebody's already taken the major risk out of it. And I'm going to try to ho-hum. I mean, nobody would answer. So my wife, who's woman number 2, she says, "All right, here's your problem." She's way better at business than I am. She says, "The problem is no one will read it." Yes. Why don't we enter it into contests? Because if they have any integrity at these places, they'll have to at least read 10 pages. Just, they can throw it away, but they'll have to at least read 10 pages. It's more than anybody's ever given me. So I called Tom, and Tom, they don't have any marketing staff. He says, "Well, fine, if you guys do all the work, we'll send it in. We just have to find out what they are and when the submission dates are." And so my wife and I started building a spreadsheet, and I'm not kidding you, we found contests that are just unbelievable. I mean, there are things like, first novel by left-handed Swedish immigrant from Ballard, Washington. I mean, there's amazing what you can find out there. And one of them was the Barnes & Noble Discover Great Writers contest. And we sent one book off to Barnes & Noble, and their staffers volunteer, and I think it's a really great program. They just volunteer to read new authors. And if they like what they read, they send it on up to New York. And some woman in the Midwest, someone said it was Milwaukee, it might have been Minneapolis, but anyway, up there someplace, loved this book. And she sent it up to Jill Lamar, who's her boss, who's a woman that's in New York, and she's the head of the whole program. She loved it, and she started asking for more copies. Tom's getting all excited. He called me on the phone, and I say to Tom, "What happens if we win?" And there's this long pause. He says, "You got any money?" Because the way it works is that, if Barnes & Noble wants to buy the book, I mean, there's no more than 1,200 stores. I mean, so there's no way that he'd have to borrow money to make the print run. And then, of course, if it doesn't sell, all the books come back, and he goes out of business. So it gets risky when Barnes & Noble knocks on your door. So Jill sent it to her boss, who's a woman named Cecily Hensley. And Cecily is sort of like the Oprah of the fiction world, because she is the chief fiction buyer for Barnes & Noble. And if she likes a book, well, every publisher in New York, stands up and salutes, and she knew that it would be asking way too much for this little press in California. And so what she did is she took the novel to her contacts in New York, publishers, and just said, "This is something that should be out, and this little outfit in California needs a joint venture partner that's got the clout that can actually do the job." And Morgan Entrekin from Grove Atlantic, he only read about half of it, and he was going to the West Coast anyway. I'd love to say that he got on the plane just for Matterhorn, but he had other things to do. But he did stop at Berkeley, and they put a deal together. And I want to plug Morgan. He's there's only 2 houses left in New York that are still run by the people that own them. All the rest are now conglomerates. And he can make these decisions and take these risks on the basis of the book. And all he needed to do for the rights to come back, El Leon had all the rights until the run sold, or 3 years went by. So Morgan just said, "Well, I'll buy the books." And so he bought all those books in the warehouse, and he just left them there. And but what he did extra, which is amazing, is he then paid Tom all of his printing costs, and then he cut him in on a percentage of the book. And so if you see it in the hardbound, it's got 2 publishers on it. El Leon Literary Arts here and Atlantic Monthly Press over there. And I mean, El Leon is no longer involved at all, but they're collecting a percentage of every hardbound that's sold. And I think they're going to probably be able to finance 5 or 6 more novels basically just because of Morgan's generosity. Just so I always like to plug him for that. Then what happened is that's how it got published, but how it got known is independent bookstores. It was bookstores just like this one all over the country, and what they were doing, and I think it was phenomenal, is that they would get the advanced readers copies, and then they would start writing emails. They would write emails to each other. They would write emails to Morgan, Twitter, things like that. I mean, it started a year ago, February. And that started to get the attention of people that review books. If it hadn't been for the buzz that was starting to build around the book, you know, when Deb Seeger, who's the publicity director, would go to someone like the New York Times or Newsweek or any of the big national outfits, they'd go like, well, you know, why would we choose this one over any of the others? But when there's that much buzz going on because of independent bookstores, then it got reviewed, and when it hit the Times, you know, front page of the literary section, and then it sort of starts going like that. So for 35 years, it's like, you know, you get nowhere, and then all of a sudden everything went right, and I'm very happy that everything went right, and it's been quite a journey. So that's the story, and I thank the independent bookstores for remodeling our kitchen. My wife's been trying to remodel it for 20 years, and it's going to happen now. So let's see. So what I thought I'd do is I'll just read a passage. Most people, you know, I won't read very long, maybe 6 minutes or so. I chose this passage tonight because it's, you know, it doesn't involve the war. It's actually a flashback that kind of evokes the era, and because I found that if I read some of the more traumatic war scenes, all I do is have a bunch of people sitting there very quietly, and there's no questions afterwards. So I stopped doing that. Setting it up a little bit, Wayne O'Mellis is the protagonist. He's a 21-year-old second lieutenant. Overwhelmed, doesn't know what's going on, frightened, and he's sitting in the dark in the monsoon. They're on an operation, and they've run out of food. It's wet, they're cold, they're miserable, and you know, nobody thought that you would be cold in Vietnam, but if you're up at 5,000 feet, it's cold. And of course, there was no cold weather gear. It was, you know, because the people in Washington, D.C. said, well, it's a warm country, you know. So, I mean, things like this, I mean, any of you who've been in the military, you know how that sort of stuff happens, and people just make do. And so he's sitting next to his radio operator, who's a 19-year-old named Hamilton, and they're just two kids, basically, in the dark, trying to, you know, buck up their spirits. And so they start talking about home, and they start talking about their old girlfriends, and which is what, you know, 19-year-olds, 21-year-olds will do. And it reminds Mellis of when he said goodbye to his girlfriend. So I'll read that passage. He remembered the night Anne told him that she couldn't go along with this weird concept of morality he'd come up with about keeping his promise to the president. It started as a wonderful meal in the New York apartment that Anne shared with two of her friends from Bryn Mawr, both of whom had made themselves discreetly absent. Anne had gone all out, not only with the bacon-wrapped chicken livers and water chestnuts, but with real French press coffee from a real French press coffee pot that she'd brought home from a junior summer in Paris. Mellis had never seen one before. He thought that the best time to tell her about sending in the letter to the Marine Corps would be over coffee. There was no best time. Mellis found himself standing with an empty coffee pot in one hand and 2 empty mugs in the other, looking at her beautiful backside. She was wearing the salmon-colored miniskirt that emphasized her small waist and hugged her bottom, the one that she knew drove him wild. "You don't even like the president," she said. Exasperated, she whirled back to face the sink of dirty dishes. "You told me yourself that he's just a manufactured image. It's not like making a promise to a person." "Yeah, but he's the president. American presidents don't lie to Americans." He felt foolish talking to her back. He's like the representation of the, I don't know, of the Constitution, for Christ's sake. I swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States. I raised my hand and I swore, so help me God. She twisted around, her hand still on the edge of the sink. "You were a high school kid. You were 17. I was still me." She turned back. "Oh God," she said to the wall. He looked dumbly at the pot and cups in his hand. Why was she mad at him? It was a sacred oath, and Two of the guys he'd gone through training with at Quantico were already dead. Well, you know, she said, still looking at the wall, Johnny Hartman got his doctor to say that knee he hurt in football would go out all the time. Jane's brother got his doctor to say he was gay. He said nothing. She let out a long sigh. Her shoulders moved just that little bit back down to where they normally sat. He realized that she'd been holding her breath. She went into her quiet voice, one he knew there was no arguing against. You got into law school. You were deferred. In 3 years the war could be over, and if it isn't, you'll do your time as a lawyer. People would kill to get to where you are. People are getting killed, better people than Johnny Hartman, Jane's brother. She turned, this time slowly. She was trembling. The tears welling from her green eyes struck him dumb and made him feel guilty. Yes, she hissed. Yes, 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 and you sent in the letter without even talking to me about it. You didn't even think to talk to me about it. A month after that, he was at the basic school in Quantico, Virginia. He found it difficult to write to her, knowing that Marine training was totally foreign to her. She responded infrequently, saying that her new career kept her busy. Once, after he'd been in Quantico nearly 3 months, he called her to say that he could get up to New York on a 3-day liberty. She said that she had already planned something in Vermont. 2 months after that, he had his orders to Vietnam. He called her and said he had to see her before he shipped out. She said okay, but warned him not to plan on spending the night.